Easter commemorates the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but is belief in Christianity and to a greater extent religion in Trinidad and Tobago on an irreversible decline? Given the challenges facing Trinidad and Tobago and Trinidad and Tobago society, what role does the church play in reshaping the narrative? And does the church have the moral obligation to do so? In this special Easter interview, I sit down with National Bishop of the Pentecostal Assemblies of the West Indies, Reverend Don Hamilton. Reverend Don Hamilton, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Ran. It's such a pleasure to be here once again. You look very young. You know?
I'll take that as a compliment. 5 years ago,
5 years ago,
we met each other and we were talking about the decline in church numbers.
Definitely.
5 years on, what have you made of the church in Trinidad and Tobago, holistically?
Well, I'll tell you this. I work as the National Bishop of the Pentecostal Assemblies of the West Indies, the Trinidad and Tobago district. And I try to be very guarded in terms of appearing to speak on behalf of the church in Trinidad and Tobago. While I have a working relationship and dialogue with other religious bodies, I think it is only fair for the religious groups to speak on their own behalf. So I may take a bird's eye view and I may stand to be corrected when you get the inner working of the parts in the other groups.
I completely understand what you're saying. Liturgically, there are differences within all churches.
Yeah.
Holistically, though, given the challenges that Trinidad and Tobago faces at the moment, is that one chapter, one sector where we could work on, where denominational churches, the different denominations, should be working closer together to really figure out the challenges that the country faces?
Right, certainly. I think I want to separate those points where we disagree from that which we could collectively approach the healing of our nation. And for that to happen, we must do deep listening to each other. I think part of the challenge is that we are not political analysts, we're not criminologists, and sometimes we stick our fingers in areas where we do not have the expertise. I think what religion should do is to speak very loud to the moral fiber of our nation. And right across the board, there is this sense in which if we do not return to moral and family values, the establishment of manners and courtesy and truth-telling, and you know, years ago, Ran, as a boy, we had this, in primary school, they had a present or a gift for good citizenship, you know, and I remember that so that the child that demonstrated collectiveness, the child that a collective discussion and contribution to the well-being of the school and the class, and you really had a prize for good citizenship. I'm not sure whether it has gone. So there are some areas of society building, nation building, that we can literally build bridges to make our nation of Trinidad and Tobago a better place. Parents who have abdicated their roles, and we have surrendered our parenting to social media, and there's this distancing from the face-to-face connection with my son and my daughter to teach these values of good citizenship.
You talk about the values that religious leaders like yourself should be imparting, but fewer and fewer people are listening because the statistics show that fewer and fewer people are attending churches across Trinidad and Tobago, particularly within the traditional churches.
Right.
What is the reason for that, Reverend?
Now, if I go to, permit me to draw on the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul was writing to the Jewish community who by and large had received the commandments of God, they have received the oracles of God, they have received the revelation of God. But Paul asks an interesting question. He says, you who teach you should not steal, do you steal? You who teach you should not lie, do you lie? So that the persons who are called to be on the vanguard sometimes of the moral question, they themselves, we ourselves, are sometimes guilty of violating that very law, which actually pulls the rug of authority from our speaking into our nation. So I do not roll the punches in that. We have to straighten out our own internal acts. We have to match what we preach with how we live. Because, tell you the truth, if you look at our young population, they're able to see through duplicity. They're able to see through hypocrisy. They're able to see, you know what, you guys are not practicing what you're preaching. So I think we must first, if I'm to take the hard statement of Jesus, deal with the mote in our own eyes before we pick out the beam in our brother's eyes. And so part of the global reality is that organized and institutional churches and organizations, they seem to have lost the moral authority to speak to the man on the street issues. So we need to bridge the gap between that. By and large, I feel there is a need for returning to the personal one-to-one engaging with people. It's not just simply that lofty pedestal of preaching abstract concepts. How do I now connect with people on a one-to-one basis and walk with people? And that's what we are called to do.
You make an interesting point that I'll nail home, because I'm guessing that you are saying that spiritual leaders need to be held to account for what is happening in not only their personal lives, but their churches' lives. Point well taken. The second thing that I would also like to ask you about would also be, as the church abdicated its responsibility in the communities, as churches become way too closed off and forgotten that they ought to be serving the most vulnerable in society.
Right. Now, the finding of church and community, unfortunately, I feel that's an artificial divide. Reason being is that traditionally, the church emerged from the community, and just as you had community centers, you had community church. So people say, well, that's my church. I attend that church. I attend that particular place of worship. So what has happened, the more we have gotten all tight into structures and organization, we have stepped back somewhat from engaging our community. So I'm in partial agreement to that, but I don't want to paint the entire brush like that. I could get lost in buildings. I could get lost in internal liturgical forms. I could get lost in, interestingly, Jesus gave the example of the Samaritan, Ryan, and he's dying, he's bleeding on the road, but the religious leaders, their heads are fixed, heading to the synagogue. And the question is, who's my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? And so the neighbor then must be the man on the street. Now, our world has changed. There was a time that churches were left open so people can just come in and sit and reflect. Now we have a serious banditry problem where nothing is sacred anymore. So, of course, you have the sense in which churches are now thinking of, how do I secure? I can tell you of several churches where their equipment was stolen, their place of worship was vandalized. So it is that kind of a dynamics we're looking at here.
But Rev, what you're saying there is not so much a structural, hierarchical problem within, the divide between communities and churches. But again, that now moves to another problem within society, which is family life.
Right.
Because the structure of a church doesn't cause someone to break into it to steal.
No. I'm not saying the structure breaks in. I'm using the structure in relation to the connection with the community. So I can be so preoccupied with structure that I forget people.
But I would like to ask you about, there has been a rise in break-ins, not just for churches, but for mosques and also for temples. What is triggering such outpouring of violence and hatred towards religious institutions?
We do have a systemic problem. And when I say systemic, it is not just religious. We are talking about the political climate. We're talking about the economic climate, talking about the social climate, the technological climate. So that if we're going to tackle this issue, it cannot be one-dimensional. One of the things in relation to your question is that there is a mentality of the haves and the have-not. And so there is a thinking here, if you perceive to have more than me and you're not sharing, then it gives me, quote unquote, legitimacy to now take from you, vandalize your place because you are not sharing with me. So it is not just a religious issue. I have seen persons, I was up in a certain place and they were looking down, I wouldn't call the place, was looking down on the Port of Spain area. And I'm listening to shop talk. And one of the guys was saying, could you imagine a certain people, they have swimming pool and we don't have water. And therefore, we will need to deal with that. So I'm saying, that's an interesting way of thinking. So one community have a swimming pool, one don't have running water at all, and therefore, I feel disenfranchised, so I need to go after that. And so part of our work as faith-based communities is to simply get back into the community and listen to the legitimate concerns of people. There are some concerns and demands, Ryan. I think they are illegal, some are illegitimate, some are lawless. So we cannot facilitate that kind of a conversation there.
Coming up, a broken society from broken families. How do we go about solving that broken family problem that is occurring in this country?
We have to engage in networking, Ryan. No one organization or group can do it alone.
Youth participation in crime. Does the church have a role to play in reversing the current trajectory of youths when it comes to criminal behavior?
I think the church has a responsibility in right across the board in nation building. But if how we do church alienate the young people, then obviously we are dropping the ball as relates to youth and crime. And so the intentional engaging our young people, I think we have missed a specific mark in how we are doing this thing. So yes, the church have a responsibility. And so I can think of empowering some youths in the church that I work with. And we are pulling youths from various cross-section of our area. But they are not, quote-unquote, churchified youths. They are young people who are working through their own challenges, their own issues. And I think if we can capture that, but here's the other thing I'm noticing, Brian. When we bring the youth, we are realizing that when you think of youth, you kind of think of youth outside of their family, outside of their parenting, outside of their career, outside of their finances. So if the church is going to bridge that gap, it's not just simply bring young people, give them a nice sermon, and say, now go home. No, we have to be thinking of, so I was saying to my own young person, hey, he says, we need to get a maxi to bring our youths. Fine. So we say to our people, you have to contribute to the maxi in terms of bringing the youth for a youth conversation, a youth meeting. We must have a vision also of youth empowerment, because there are so many other groups doing stuff, but with youth empowerment, with the element of the morality training, yes, the church must get involved there.
Let's talk a little bit about family life. You are not only a reverend, but many people also know you as a family psychologist.
Yes. Sure.
The breakdown in family life in this country, how much has that, and that continues to affect the current state of Trinidad and Tobago?
You're asking both a current and a historic question. Based on the race composition, I have found family dynamics differ. You have the Asian, the African, the East Indian, and I find the family dynamic, because when we begin to talk about structure is how the family is arranged. Status is the positions people hold in the family, and role is the responsibilities. So here's what, I don't think we have taught properly how the family should be structured. We have a model of what you call egalitarian. Everybody have equal power. or a hedonistic structure where everybody do what is right in their own eyes. And so something is missing there. And then we get to status, your position in the family. What is my position? You've seen the emasculation of males for some years, and you want to know, where is the male? You know, there was a writer, Errol Miller from Jamaica. He wrote a book some years ago, Men at Risk. And where are the men? They are on the fringe of society. They are in prison. They are on the street. And so how do we get back male in terms of their own structure? And then children. It's a total disregard for parenting, authority, and so on. So as I do family, I see a lot of displaced, confused family members, which automatically leads to that breakdown. And you have, we have the backlash of children who made children and grandparents who have now, they are so young that they're competing with their own youth. And so that is part of the breakdown I'm seeing as I relate to family, helping persons in the family understand their role and their responsibility.
How do we go about then mending what has been broken with family life? Because most people agree, most intellectuals agree, that there will be no solution to crime if we don't solve the family problem. I mean, even the Prime Minister has been speaking about this time and time again, about when he's talking about crime. How do we go about solving that broken family problem that is occurring in this country?
We have to engage in networking, Ryan. No one organization or group can do it alone. And as I go back to deep listening, so there are groups dealing with single parent and single parenting. There are groups dealing with parents by themselves. You have groups dealing with children and teenage. And would to God that we can say, hey, hold on a while. This thing is broken real badly. You have a piece of the answer. I have a piece of the answer. Across, they have a piece of the answer. Just a few days ago, I was in Point, and we had a particular initiative with close to 100 men speaking to the broken issues that men face. And then I was in Superior dealing with some issues relating to a person's identity formation. So what I'm saying, I don't have all the answers. So in mending this thing, we need to have this networking of the helping agencies and saying, okay, what piece of the pie are you bringing to this conversation? And we listen to each other, and then we do those initiatives in terms of the events that we are going to be having to help empower the family members. But you have what you call a lot of pocket activities going on across the nation, and so it is not documented in such a consistent and systematic way, so we can have a bigger picture and say, okay, here's what is happening actually. You're doing your piece there, you're doing your piece there, but there isn't the coming together. Whatever is hindering that block, it's not gelling in that kind of a way.
Coming up, with a decline in church numbers and a rise in crime, do you as a reverend fear that we are moving away from what was a God-fearing society to now something probably a godless society? When you look at Trinidad and Tobago as a society right now, and let's not only talk about crime here,
right,
but also let's look at perhaps the level of corruption, the level of deceit, the level of mismanagement happening across various sectors, the level of nepotism. Do you as a reverend fear that we are moving away from what was a God-fearing society to now something probably a godless society?
You asked a tough one there from the standpoint of I can speak for my core religious values. And for my core religious values, the Bible says that evil men and seducers will get worse and worse, deceive and being deceived. So as it comes to what we would use in religious terms, closer to the end time, there'll be an increase in evil. Why? Because men's heart, and no politician, no doctor, no sociologist, not even religion, can touch, for me, the core issues of the human heart, because we will push transformation as over against education, and that is from that particular point. Now, from another standpoint, we are saying, if there is the breakdown with the crime and the violence, the corruption and so on, law is for the lawless and the disobedient. Part of the challenge we have is, are we seeing the moral fiber of those who are given the task of exacting the law? We're not seeing that. I have had some personal experiences where, let's say, I've reported possible crime, and how it was managed, Ryan, I stepped back and I said, hold on a while. Do I have the confidence in the system? And if I have to work through, because you don't want vigilantes. That is people taking the law into their own hands. But the point about it, people vested with that responsibility, they really need to rise up and show them.
Are you often surprised that a country that has been steeped in religion, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, and so many others religions have come to a place of such violence?
Yes and no. The no part of it, but let me deal with the yes. Are we a religious country or a secular country? There are those who have argued that Trinidad and Tobago is a secular society, and therefore religion should not, and religious values should not dictate how we. So if you move to the thinking that we are a secular society, then the reference point about our religion and our religious base, then that will be sidelined. Because the secular framework conveys something quite different. While you could have levels of morality issues, but when you begin to think of it, you say, okay, we have Christianity, we have Hinduism, we have Islam, these are core-based, religious. But if the relevant authorities are saying to us that we are not religious, we are secular, then obviously the values that may come from the religious framework. So I'm not surprised from the standpoint that we have switched and changed the script where we are now saying we are secular and we are not necessarily religious. Having said that, for me, secular humanism defines morality by its own self, human laws, human reference point. And because of that, the sense of an ultimate accountability to a higher power, we have removed that. So we become the reference to our own morality.
You talk about that, and I'm sorry to cut you in, but you talk about secularism. How much did COVID-19 change the face of church in Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, maybe on several levels. First of all, let me go to the theological. Christianity is a religion of what is called Incarnational Consciousness. God became man and dwelt among us. So a whole heap of what we do have to do with the incarnation. You touch, he dwelt, he tabernacled, you walk with. So that the challenge the church has is, how do you, as an incarnational community, continue to do that when you have distance, social distance? So some have argued, well, you could have service, but you cannot have incarnational consciousness. So the struggle would be, things like communion, visiting the sick, visiting the poor, and there's a significant change that occurred in how you do business. The other thing would be many of the churches, Rand, were not prepared for technology. And so they were lagging behind, and people are scrambling how to understand using the platform to deliver message. Some ministers have to preach to empty churches, and that affected their psychology a little bit, assuming that you're just preaching to, who are you preaching to? And then you had a high fluidity of persons who have switched, because remember now, you have an online platforms where you could visit 5 or 6 religious meetings in one day, and hey, what is happening here? Where are my people? And there are some people who have not returned. They have become comfortable with the online offering. And so many churches experience a drop in physical presence, a drop in finances, a drop in physical participation. And so you have to now revisit, how are you doing church? So it's had a significant impact now. If in fact I listen across the board, I'm hearing dropping numbers, and I don't know if that we have done a studied work to find out whether people have staying at home or whether they shifted their allegiance to some other group. But it's very, very fluid like that, very, very fluid like that. And that is the challenge that I think the church has experienced. One, how do I translate this incarnational consciousness where we cannot touch, feel anymore? And two, how do we adjust to the new technology of doing church and making that kind of a mental adjustment? I mean, I have preached to so many open cameras and empty places, and you have to now assume, okay, who's there? Who's listening? Am I connecting? And that flesh to flesh, person to person feedback, no longer there.
Reverend Don Hamilton, good to talk to you 5 years later. Let's make it happen more often.
Please, sir. Please, sir. Thank you very much for the privilege.
Appreciate it.
All right, good, sir.